Ever notice how your team suddenly becomes tense when you walk into the room or send an email? Have you wondered why they seem to shut down when a certain notification pops up? What if I told you that you might be the bell your team is reacting to, just like Pavlov's dogs? In today's video, we're going to explore how a 19th century experiment involving dogs can explain some of the most common behaviors we see in the workplace today. Stay with me. By the end, you'll discover how understanding this can transform the way you lead your team and improve your workplace dynamics. It all started in the late 1800s with Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist who was studying digestion. While he wasn't trying to discover anything about behavior, something unusual caught his attention. He noticed that the dogs he was studying would start salivating even before they were given food. This got Pavlov thinking. Could the dogs be associating the presence of the lab assistant with the arrival of food? So, Pavlov decided to test this theory. He introduced a completely neutral stimulus, a bell. Every time he fed the dogs, he rang the bell. After repeating this several times, something remarkable happened. The dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell, even when no food was present. Pavlov had discovered classical conditioning, a type of learning where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a meaningful one, triggering a specific response. This discovery was groundbreaking for psychology. It showed that behavior could be shaped by external stimuli, and that responses could be conditioned over time. Fast forward to today, and you might be surprised to see how Pavlov's discovery is still at play, not just with dogs, but in your office. Think about it. How does your team react when you send an email or call a meeting? Are they enthusiastic, or do they seem nervous or disengaged? Much like Pavlov's dogs learned to associate the bell with food, your team has likely learned to associate certain cues, like emails, meetings, or even your presence with specific outcomes. If those outcomes are consistently stressful, your team might start reacting to you in a conditioned way, just like Pavlov's dogs. The point is, if your interactions are often tied to stress or pressure, your team will begin to associate you with those emotions. Over time, even the sound of your voice or the sight of your name in their inbox could trigger an automatic, stress-induced reaction. You have unintentionally become the bell in their environment. Let me introduce you to Emily. She's a passionate, hardworking project manager at a tech company. But lately, she's noticed something strange. Every time she calls a meeting or sends an email, her team seems to shut down. They become quiet, avoid eye contact, and don't offer ideas. What Emily doesn't realize is that she's been conditioning her team over time. Whenever she calls a meeting, it's usually to deal with a crisis. Her emails often carry bad news or urgent requests. Over the past few months, her team has learned to associate interactions with Emily as stressful and draining. Without meaning to, Emily has become the bell her team reacts to. Just like Pavlov's dogs, her team has developed conditioned responses based on past experiences. And now, even her presence is enough to trigger anxiety in the team. This is where the concept of classical conditioning becomes crucial in leadership. Classical conditioning is about association. When a neutral stimulus, like a bell, becomes linked with a specific outcome, like food. In the workplace, those neutral stimuli could be anything. Your emails, your tone of voice, your meetings. The outcome? Stress, pressure, or even disengagement. The problem is, once these associations are formed, they're hard to break. Your team isn't reacting to you as a person anymore. They're reacting to the cue you represent. This is why, as a leader, it's essential to recognize the signals you're sending and what they're triggering in your team. But here's the good news. Just like Pavlov's dogs could be conditioned to respond to a bell, you can recondition your team to respond positively. It's all about changing the associations you've unknowingly created. Emily decides to change the way she communicates with her team. Instead of only reaching out when there's a problem, she starts sending praise and recognition through her emails. She schedules regular check-ins that focus on what's going well before discussing challenges. By introducing more positive reinforcement, Emily begins to reshape her team's expectations of her interactions. Over time, Her team begins to associate Emily's emails and meetings with encouragement, not just pressure. They no longer tense up when she calls a meeting, and they become more engaged in discussions. Now, let's break down how you can apply this to your own leadership style. Here are 4 actionable steps to start reconditioning your team today. Step 1. Identify the cues. Take a close look at the signals you're sending. Are your emails always tied to urgent requests? Do you only call meetings when there's a problem? Identify what stimuli might be creating stress for your team. Step 2. Introduce positive associations. Once you've identified the cues, it's time to change the associations. Start incorporating more positive reinforcement into your interactions. Send emails that highlight achievements. Begin meetings by acknowledging successes before discussing any challenges. Step 3. Stay consistent. Consistency is key when reconditioning behavior. Don't expect immediate results. Pavlov rang that bell over and over before the dogs were fully conditioned. In the same way, you'll need to consistently reinforce the positive associations with your team. Step 4. Foster psychological safety. Lastly, create an environment where your team feels safe to speak up and contribute without fear of stress. This can be achieved through regular check-ins, open dialogue, and building trust. By reconditioning the way her team responds to her, Emily has created a more positive and productive work environment. Her team is more engaged, motivated, and less stressed. They no longer associate her presence with pressure, but with support and guidance. This is the power of classical conditioning in leadership. By understanding the cues you're sending and intentionally reconditioning your team's responses, you can build a work culture that promotes growth, motivation, and psychological safety. So, are you the bell your team is reacting to? Reflect on how you can change the signals you're sending and start building a more positive and thriving work environment today.